Welcome to my video lecture series in Game Concept and Production. This is Professor Janus Raymond Tan from the College of Computing and Engineering. For this video lecture, we will cover the topics about the formal elements of games, which are important factors to consider if you are designing your own game. Throughout this video, we will discuss what are the formal elements of games, what are the game atoms, game as systems, and the critical analysis of games. To develop a game, it is best to constrain ourselves at the start of our design process to some core elements of games. We begin by brainstorming elements that we find in all games. However, there is no progress in exhaustively defining what exactly a game is. We simply use this as a starting point to wrap our head around the elements in games that we are going to work with game designers. We have to start somewhere to develop this new medium, and this list serves as a good starting point. When you are designing a game, an interesting approach to take is to think about your game's core first. This would be your core mechanic, the one particular pattern of actions that you want your player to take over and over again. The best way to think about cores is to look at board games and take some concepts from there. Now, what are formal elements of games? It helps create a game structure. The relationship between these formal elements is what forms a game. Therefore, as game designers, we have to get acquainted with these formal game elements. This is not an exclusive list of game elements, and by combining them, it is possible to create different game elements as well as novel forms of interaction and gameplay. With these tools, you will hopefully be able to create meaningful decisions in your own games. It differs on who we will ask. Like the definition of game, none is perfect. But by looking at all of them, we can see some emerging themes that can shed light on the kinds of things that we need to create as game designers if we take or make games. First on the list as a formal element are players. It answers the questions such as, how many players does the game support? Must it be an exact number, 4 players only, or a variable number, 2 to 5 players? Can players enter or leave during play? If so, how does this affect play? What is the relationship between players? Are there teams or individuals? Can teams be uneven? For the player structures, we have solitaire or one versus the game system. Examples include the card game Klondike, sometimes just called solitaire, and the video game Minesweeper. Next is head-to-head or one player versus one player. Chess and Go are classic examples. PvE or multiple player versus the game system. This is common in MMOs or massively multiplayer online like World of Warcraft. Some purely cooperative board games exist too, such as Nietzsche's Lord of the Rings, Arkham Horror, and Pandemic. One against many or one player versus a series of other players. The casino game Blackjack is an example where the house is playing as a single player against several other players, but those other players are not affecting each other much and do not really help or hinder or play against each other. Free for all or one player versus multiple players. The board game Scotland Yard is a great example of this. It pits a single player as Mr. X against a team of detectives. Separate individuals against the system or one player versus one player versus one player and so on. Perhaps the most common player structure for multiplayer games, this can be found everywhere, from board games like Monopoly to multiplayer deathmatch play in most first-person shooter video games. Team competition or multiple players versus multiple players. This is also a common structure finding its way into most team sports, card games like Bridge and Spades, team-based online games like Capture the Flag modes, from first-person shooters and numerous other games. Predator Prey. Players from a real or virtual circle, everyone's goal is to attack the player on their left and defend themselves from the player on the right. The college game Assassination and the trading card game Vampire, the Eternal Struggle, both use this structure. Five-pointed star, like the five-player Magic the Gathering variant. The goal is to eliminate both of the players who are not on either side of you. Number 2, objectives or goals. This is often one of the first things you can ask yourself when designing a game if you're stuck and don't know where to begin. Once you know the objective, many of the other formal elements will seem to define themselves for you. It answers the questions such as, what is the object of the game? What are the players trying to do? Some common objectives: capture and destroy, where eliminating your opponent's pieces from the game. Chess and Stratego are some well-known examples where you must eliminate the opposing forces to win. Territorial control, where is the focus to not necessarily on destroying the opponent, but on controlling certain areas of the board. Risk and diplomacy are examples. Collection. Many platformer video games included levels where you had to collect a certain number of objects scattered throughout the level. Examples are collecting keys or items. Solve. The board game Clue is an example of a game where the objective is to solve a puzzle. Lesser known but more interesting examples is Castle of Magic. Chase, race, escape. Generally, anything where you are running towards a way or something. From the playground game Tag and the video game Super Mario Bros. Are examples. Spatial alignment. A number of games involve positioning of elements as an objective, including non-digital games like Tic-Tac-Toe, Pente, and video game Tetris. Build. The opposite of destroy. Your goal is to advance your character or build your resources to a certain point. The Sims has strong elements of this. The board game Settlers of Catan is an example also. Negation of another goal. Some games end when one player performs an act that is forbidden by the rules and that player loses. Examples are the physical dexterity games Twister and Jenga. Number 3 formal element is procedures. These are actions or methods of play allowed by a game's rules. They can be specific instructions of what actions to take during play. They can also refer to a specific set of controls. Serve to process the input of a player in a computer game. Procedures can specify actions that are impossible or inefficient outside of the magic circle of the game. You have to answer who, does, what, where, and when, and how. Player actions as specified by procedures can be split up into the following. Starting, how the game is put into play, also leading on to onboarding of players. In PUBG, the BR mode or Battle Royale mode, it begins with dropping from a plane. Progression. These are ongoing procedures running during gameplay, like shrinking zone in PUBG. Next, special. These are actions that are only available based on other elements and changes the game state. Example, the changes in weather or environment. Resolving. These actions bring your game to an end. In PUBG, we have resolving action if two teams or two players are remaining. Number 4 formal element is rules or mechanics. These are exact objects and concepts of your game. It will define the possible outcome towards the progression of play. Building blocks of the game system. It is because it sets the boundaries of a game, the authority of your game world, and in summary, rules serve 3 main purposes: defining objects and conditions, restricting player actions, and determining effects on players. As a game designer, you want to be able to describe the actions for all possible situations in your rule set. Your rule set specifies everything a player can do and cannot do. This means that you have often to limit the actions a player is allowed to do, and you have to think about reactions of the game to player actions. Number 5 formal element is resources. Game objects that have a value for players in reaching their individual objectives. The value of these items can be determined by their scarcity and utility. The value for players is often scaled by how much an item helps a player achieve a goal. As a designer, you control the availability or scarcity of an item. You can help the guide player to find resources, and you can put systems in place that govern how resources are managed and when they become scarce. Examples are lives, units, health, actions, inventory, time. Number 6 formal element is conflict. It emerges through procedures and rules in the game that prevent the player from achieving their goal. These are the things that will bring challenge to the player before reaching its goal. Examples are obstacles in a game level that leads the player to encounter hazardous events. Objectives often guide players to this conflict situation. The main conflict in many first-person shooters is to stay alive while player or non-player characters try to kill you. The conflict in pinball would be to keep the ball from rolling out of the playing field only with the mechanical devices, often flippers, the machines provides to you. Three types of conflict that are common in games. Number one is obstacles. This can be physical or mental form. Physical obstacle could be the length of your pinball flippers or the bumpers that the ball bounces off. Mental obstacles can be a missing item to complete a riddle in an adventure game or the challenge of calculating the right numbers in Sudoku. Opponents, the other players in the game, or computer-controlled enemies. Dilemmas, these are problematic choices that a player is faced with. Is a strategic decision where the consequences have to be weighted before proceeding. The figure shows that conflict emerges when objective guide players towards rules and procedures that work against the player's goal. Number 7 formal element is boundaries. It means this is the border to the real world or the separation of the magic circle and real world. It relates to actions that are only possible in the game but would have much different consequences outside the game boundaries. It can also relate to the playing field, the skybox, like in Unity, or other limiting geometry in your game world. Number 8 formal element is outcomes. It has to be uncertain to foster player interest. In games, the outcome is often measurable like points and uneven. Winning conditions are different from player objectives. Since players have invested much time and emotion into a game, it is hard to create a resolution that satisfies this investment of players. Game atom is defined as the smallest possible design element by the book Challenges for Game Designers. These game atoms are broken down into players or avatars or game bits. Players set the rules of the game in motion and often have some form of representation in the game world. Examples, tokens, or pawns. Some games don't have representations and the player represents themselves. Objectives or goals, often referred to as missions or quests, they are like a task list for your players telling them what they should be working toward. Rules or mechanics. In games, mechanics determine how something works, much like game rules do. They are about the possibilities for the players that will change the game state. Rules are the most defining quality of games. The following are general properties of rules: to limit player actions, explicit and unambiguous, shared by all players, fixed, binding, and repeatable. Resources. Game objects have a value for players in reaching their individual objectives. Game states, the state of the gameplay system or the game system at one point in your game loop, essentially everything that you would write into a save file, a collection of relevant variable game information that changes during gameplay. Game views. Different stages of the game may allow the player to see different information. The parts of the game state that are visible to a player are called the game view. Information. All the information necessary to play the game. Sequencing. The order in which rules unfold, similar to turns in a board game. This is important for thinking about when the information in a game changes, player interaction, the types of interaction allowed for players, theme or setting. While setting is not mandatory for games, many games have some sort of theme that helps players to make sense in information. It is what game is all about. This can refer to things such as color, theme, story, or narrative. It helps players feel more at home with your game mechanics. Now, let's talk about game as systems. A game is a closed formal system that subjectively represents a subset of reality according to Chris Crawford. First, if you change even one formal element, it can make for a very different game. Each formal element of a game contributes in a deep way to the player's experience. When designing a game, give thought to each of these elements and make sure that each is a deliberate choice. Second, note that these elements are interrelated, and changing one can affect others. Rules govern changes in game state. Information can sometimes become a resource. Sequencing can lead to different kinds of players' interaction. Changing the number of players can affect what kinds of objectives can be defined and so on. Now, let's talk about the critical analysis of games. So, it is not just a game review. We are not concerned with how many out of 5 stars or any numbers from 0 to 10, or whether or not a game is fun or aiding in the consumer decision of whether or not to buy a game. It does not just mean a list of things that are wrong with the game. The word critical in this context does not mean fault finding, but rather a thorough and unbiased look at the game. It is useful when discussing or comparing games. You can say, I like the card game Bang because it's fun, but that does not help designers to learn why is it fun. They must look at the parts of games and how they interact in order to understand how each part relates to the play experience. It is also useful when examining our own works in progress. For a game that you're working on, how do you know what to add or remove to make it better? In summary, to develop a game, it is best to constrain ourselves at the start of our design process to some core elements of games. Formal elements of games can create or help create a game structure. Game atom is the smallest possible design element of a game, and critical analysis is not just a game review. For this lesson's activity, form a 5-member group and select an existing computer or mobile game which is popular nowadays. Identify and describe each of the 8 formal elements you found on your selected game. Follow the given format and attach your PDF file which contains your answers in the Week 3 channel of our teams. Include the names of the members of the group. So here is the format that you'll be using. That's it for now. Thank you for watching and hope you enjoyed this video. For inquiries, feel free to post your questions in our group chat. In our next video, we will discuss all about mechanics and dynamics. Don't forget to visit the links in the references section for more information about this lesson. See you in the next video.